Here now is an exclusive CVBT audio interview on an issue that impacts business and the people who do business here in the Great Central Valley.
Lloyd, you have been a critic of a lot of government statistics over the years, saying that they just haven't been accurate when they talk about small business. And you're taking this to another level, suing the Pentagon. Would you tell us about that, please?
Yeah. So back in 1989, the Pentagon passed a program called the Comprehensive Subcontracting Plan Test Program. And if you look at the website, it says the purpose of the program was to increase subcontracting opportunities for small businesses. And the program had two elements. Number one, the elimination of all transparency for the public on how Pentagon prime contractors were working with small businesses. And number two, the elimination of all penalties for noncompliance. So think about a federal program that says right on the top that this is a program to see if we can increase opportunities for small businesses. And we're going to eliminate all transparency for Congress, the media, the public, and small businesses. And number two, we're going to eliminate previously existing penalties for prime contractors that don't hit their small business subcontracting goals. And it's a test, by the way. So the name is Comprehensive Subcontracting Plan Test Program. Now, I think a reasonable time frame to test that would have been maybe a year. Does that sound reasonable? Maybe 2 years?
Well, perhaps government sometimes moves slow.
Well, we're into our 27th year of testing now. So that the government, the Pentagon has been testing for 27 years where they're eliminating all transparency on small business subcontracts and elimination of any penalties help small businesses. I think that's astounding. So what I did was I requested a report. I actually picked a company at random. I picked Sikorsky. And I said, I'd like to see their report from 2012. I actually picked that up, just out of the sky too. And not surprisingly, they said, no, you can't see that. So I sued them. And I sued them in federal district court in San Francisco. And the judge said this. He said, so it would be more, this is the judge, quote, the judge, in a hearing, he said this. So it'd be more like a David and Goliath. You get to come in there again and be the underdog against the big government and against the big company. They're trying to suppress the evidence. And another hearing, the judge said, the purpose of the Freedom of Information Act is so the public can see how our government works. The government passed this program so small businesses could have access to some of these projects. And here's the United States covering it up. So a federal judge in two separate hearings accused the United States of suppressing evidence and trying to cover up evidence in this program. So we won at the district court level, and then the Pentagon and Sikorsky appealed it to the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. And the funny thing was the Ninth Circuit judges never saw the documents because it wasn't part of the court record. So they never saw the documents. And they ruled, I think they reversed and remanded it back to the district court. So now I'm back in the district court. I've got a trial against the Pentagon December 11th of this year. And we're going to start deposing people from the Pentagon and from Sikorsky on the 28th of June. And so I think we're going to uncover, quite frankly, I would say trillions in fraud, not millions, not billions, but trillions just in the last, I'll say, 10 years. But when you go back to 1989, it's clearly been trillions. So
when you say trillions in fraud, Lloyd, are you talking about trillions or billions going into somebody's pocket or Swiss bank account, or what?
I'm talking about federal law says that a minimum of 23% of all federal contracts should go to small businesses. The federal acquisition budget for last year, according to the Congressional Budget Office, and according to a legal opinion written by Professor Charles Tiefer, who is one of the nation's leading experts on contracting law, but the acquisition budget is around 1.2 trillion. So 23% of that would be 276 billion. So in fiscal year 2016, American small businesses and middle class should have received a minimum of 276 billion in federal contracts and subcontracts. The SBA put out a press release on May 18th only claiming to have awarded 99 billion. And when you look at that number, again, according to information from the government's own database, the Office of Federal Procurement. It's called the Federal Procurement Data System. According to information from the Federal Procurement Data System, most of the 99 billion that they say went to small businesses went to Fortune 500 firms and their subsidiaries and large businesses around the world. You're talking about, Rolls-Royce, British Aerospace, Finmeccanica in Italy, Sanjong Corporation in South Korea, even a Russian-owned arms dealer called Roseborn Exports got federal small business contracts. So when you look at the dollar volume of federal contracts that likely went to legitimate small businesses, it's probably around 30 billion. They should have gotten 276. And we know that's gone on for a decade. So that's well over 2.5 trillion just in the last 10 years. And that's where.
So you're saying large companies and foreign companies are getting American taxpayer dollars that should be going to small business. Is there some legal reason why that would not be happening that the Pentagon and other parts of the government could cite to you?
No. In fact, it's blatantly illegal. The Small Business Act defines a small business being independently owned. And one of the definitions of independently owned is not publicly traded. So if you're a publicly traded company, you're not independently owned. And the Small Business Act also defines small businesses having generally no more than 500 employees. And the Small Business Act says in determining a company's status as a small business, you must include the number of employees of any parent company or subsidiaries. So as soon as a Fortune 500 firm acquires a small business, they're no longer a small business. So it's expressly forbidden in federal law. In fact, here's 3 questions that I would love to have some journalist ask the SBA. Number 1, can you provide me with a section of the Small Business Act that you use to justify reporting awards to Fortune 500 firms as small business awards? Number 2, can you provide me with a section of the Small Business Act that you use to exclude about 2/3 of all federal acquisitions from your calculations on the percentage awards went to small businesses? For 15 years, the SBA said this is miscoding and computer glitches. No journalist has ever asked the SBA in over 15 years to explain why do these supposed random errors always divert federal small business contracts to Fortune 500 firms. Clearly, it's not a random situation. It's intentional, it's willful, and it's blatantly illegal. And again, by the way, this has been on, I would say, every major television network in the country. It's been in every major newspaper. Every year since 2005, the SBA Inspector General has reported the diversion of federal small business contracts to large businesses as the #1 management problem at the SBA. The GAO found over 5,000 large businesses getting federal small business contracts back in 2003. And I just saw a report a few days ago from a company called FedMine up in Washington that says in 2016, over 5,000 large businesses got small business contracts. So,
Well, Lloyd, surely this can't be Republican or Democrat, because over this period of time, you've had Republican-controlled Congresses, Democratic-controlled Congresses, you've had Democrats in the White House and Republicans in the White House. What the heck, then, is going on to cause this?
Well, I think the word is plutocracy. So if you look at it, our government is run by big corporations. And I don't think there's any question about that. If you go on opensecret.org and look at who's funding these campaigns, it's big corporations. So I think most Americans, if you're Democrat, Republican, or Independent, they don't realize that it doesn't matter who the president is. And this situation is typical. So I've been fighting this for 25 years. So my attorneys tell me that I've won more legal battles against the government than anyone they've ever heard of. I've won over 100 legal battles against the government. And nothing's changed, for 25 years. So for 25 years, this sham program that allows the Pentagon to cheat the middle class has been renewed every year by Congress for 27 years. But it's an example of how our government really works. If you really want to know how government works, look at the Comprehensive Subcontracting Plan Test Program. Look at there must have been dozens and dozens of federal investigations that have found for over 15 years that the federal government is cheating the middle class out of trillions, and yet nothing happens. In fact, in 2014, American Express open forum recognized me as one of the 4 strongest voices for small business in Washington. And I challenge anybody in the country to find anyone from a group in Washington claims to represent small businesses on national television objecting to the government defrauding small business. I don't think you can find anybody but me. And find anyone other than me that's ever written legislation to stop it. So it's actually, quite frankly, I think it's one of the most astounding situations I've ever seen in government. And here's some statistics I want people to remember. According to the U.S. Census Bureau, there are 28 million small businesses in America. 98% of all U.S. firms have less than 100 employees, and they're responsible for 98% of the net new jobs. In 2007, the SBA put out a study that said that over 90% of all U.S. firms have less than 20 employees, and they create 97% of the net new jobs. Think about that. Companies with less than 20 employees create 97% of the net new jobs. I challenge anybody to find any piece of legislation in your lifetime that was specifically written to benefit the small businesses that create 97% of net new jobs. You can't find one. There isn't one. So it's really just, I think it's absolutely astounding. And of course, it's almost impossible to report on it. It's very difficult to report on it. I've even talked to government watchdog groups in Washington, and they won't touch it. It's such a hot issue that the Pentagon, responds so strongly against anyone that even mentions it, that it's gone largely unreported for about the last 3 to 4 years.
Well, short of going to the courts, what do you think can be done?
Well, I've tried everything. I've spent years walking the halls of Congress, talking to members of Congress. That didn't do any good. I had my bill that I wrote, the Fairness and Transparency Contracting Act, introduced to Congress 3 times. It never made it out of committee. And quite frankly, I've pretty much been isolated from the media. If you're a journalist for CNN or MSNBC or ABC, you can't talk to me. You can't write about me. That sounds like a conspiracy theory. Try it. Try it. In fact, how about this? Anyone that thinks that's a conspiracy theory, call the Small Business Administration, talk to their press office. They've got 3 questions for you. Number 1, can you give me the section of the Small Business Act that you use to report awards to Fortune 500 firms, the Small Business Awards? Can you give me the section of the Small Business Act that you use to exclude 2/3 of all federal acquisitions from your calculations when you claim that small businesses got 24%? And for 15 years, they've claimed that it was miscoding. Can you explain to me why these random errors always divert small business contracts to large businesses? Try that. So any journalist in the country, try that. Make 1 phone call to the SB's press office and try to get somebody to answer those questions and see what happens.
I suspect you know the answer already.
Well, yes. I'll tell you a funny story. 10 years ago, I got very frustrated with trying to get this out there in the news. The New York Times, Ron Nixon for the New York Times wrote a 3,000-word story about my campaign to end fraud in federal small business contracting. I thought, this is going to be a major home run. He turned the story into his editor, who cut it in half, removing any mention of my name. And so I said, I'm going to start working with freelance journalists. So I found a guy who had been the White House correspondent for a major European newspaper. I won't say the name. It's one of the biggest newspapers in England. And I told him how I was having a hard time getting this story out. And he laughed. He told me a story how he had exposed fraud in the financial markets in England. He'd interviewed Tony Blair, and he just thought it was laughable that you couldn't get a story about the SBA. He said, I'll call him right now. I'll tell him I'm doing a story about you, and I'll call you back and tell you what they said. I never heard from the guy ever again. Right? I've been through that 100 times. I've talked to journalists about this, and they've interviewed me for sometimes 2 hours. And I'll say, I don't think your story's going to ever run. That says you can't write about this. And I remember one woman got mad at me and said I'd challenged her journalistic integrity. Well, her story never ran. I worked with the Associated Press probably, I want to say in 2005. And the Associated Press wrote a big story about this. The guy called me and said, we want to get you on camera with John Kerry and Nita Velasquez. Back then, John Kerry was chair of the Senate Small Business Committee. Nita Velasquez was chair of the House Small Business Committee. And this guy said, we're going to release this on all of our media outlets. And that's actually the first time that I understood the Associated Press work with TV and radio and not just newspapers. And so I thought, again, this is going to be great. Never ran. The story never ran. And but if it sounds like a conspiracy theory, call the SBA press office, talk to their press office director, Terry Sutherland. Tell me writing a story about Lloyd Chapman's lawsuit against the Pentagon to expose fraud in federal small business contracting. See what happens. See if you can get the story out. I say you can't. CNN can't do it. Fox can't do it. ABC, NBC, CBS, the New York Times couldn't do it. Washington Post can't do it. But again, if anyone thinks I'm wrong, try it. Make a phone call to the SBA press office. Call the chair of the Senate Small Business Committee and ask them why they haven't passed legislation to stop this. Call the SBA Inspector General and try to get a hold of that person and see what happens. And you'll be shocked. You'll be shocked.
Well, Lloyd, you've given us a lot to think about. What would you like to add that we've not talked about?
All right. I was on vacation last year in Scottsdale, Arizona, and on the front page of the paper, I saw that the Federal Reserve had decided not to raise interest rates because of a poor jobs report. I began to look into it, and I remember, stories where when the jobs report came out, if it was a weak jobs report, the stock market would go down. And if it was a strong jobs report, the stock market would go up. Have you seen that before? Does that sound familiar to you?
Well, we try to avoid the stock market as much as we can here.
So so the government's monthly jobs report, the U.S. and actually international markets respond to that. If it's a weak report, the stock market goes down. If it's strong, it goes up. Well, think back what I said earlier, that the U.S. Census Bureau says small businesses create 90% of the net new jobs. So since small businesses create 90% of the net new jobs, isn't the jobs report the small business jobs report? That makes sense, right? You can't argue with that. In fact, quite frankly, some independent groups like the Chapman Foundation say small businesses create 100% of the net new jobs, but I'll go ahead and go with 98%. So what's the largest economic stimulus program in history for the middle class? Well, it's the Small Business Act that mandates 23% of all federal contracts go to small businesses. That's $276 billion a year. Under TARP, small businesses got $1 billion. Under the American Reinvestment Recovery Act, they got $2 billion. And that's a one-time shot deal. So think about the difference between $3 billion one time with TARP and the American Reinvestment Recovery Act, and 276 every year in perpetuity. So clearly the Small Business Act is the largest economic stimulus program in history. So as opposed to the 23% that small businesses should be getting by law, it looks like they're getting maybe 3% when you look at the numbers from the Congressional Budget Office and all the government data. So it looks like the middle class is being shorted out of about 20% of all federal contracts. Well, about 10 years ago, the U.S. Senate Small Business Committee did a report that said for every 1% that federal contracts to small businesses go up, it would create 100,000 new jobs. So if contracts to small businesses go up 20%, that would be 2 million new jobs. So this is not a conspiracy theory. This is based upon information from the Congressional Budget Office and the Fair Procurement Data System and the Senate Small Business Committee. So I've got an injunction against the SBA in federal court right now. It's in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals in San Francisco. If I win the injunction and a federal judge stops the SBA from reporting awards to large businesses as small business awards and stops the SBA from excluding about $800 billion a year in federal acquisitions from their calculations, and the government gives small businesses the 23% the law requires, based upon the Senate report, it looks like that's going to create 2 million new jobs a year. The government's only claiming to be creating 2.5 a year, which I think is highly inflated. So if I win that injunction case, it could double the number of new jobs that are created in America. And it looks like it would cause a significant boost in the national economy. But I think that, again, that's all based upon the Congressional Budget Office and the Fair Procurement Data System and a study from the Senate. There's no conspiracy theories in those calculations. So Ending fraud in federal small business contracting could have, I think, a more dramatic impact on the middle class economy than anything that's happened in 50 years.
Lloyd, where can our listeners get more information about you and your organization?
Well, the American Small Business League is ASBL.com. I've got a website called LloydChapman.com that's got all my videos on there. I'm starting to do weekly podcasts. So on the ASBL website, in the upper right-hand corner, you can see the media website, the media page. And I've got podcasts, and I'm going to start to do videos. But just look at my previous television appearances. Quite frankly, I've been talking about this for 25 years. I don't really have much new to talk about. It's the same old thing every year, year after year after year. Fortune 500 firms are getting small business contracts. I saw something a few weeks ago that poverty is at a 50-year high, homeownership's at a 48-year low, birth rates are down for 6 consecutive years, and more people between the ages of 25 and 35 have had to move back in with their parents. So the middle class economy is collapsing. This is one of the reasons why, and people need to get together, call their congressman, call their senator, and if you know anybody in the media, call them. We need to get this back on national television and bring an end to this.
This has been another exclusive CVBT audio interview. If you found this interesting and informative, please tell your friends where you heard it, and feel free to download the audio for your reference. You are tuned to CentralValleyBusinessTimes.com, the place to go for business news of the Great Central Valley.